January 17th, 1945. The air over the Ruhr Valley is a crystalline, biting shroud of winter. Below, the Rhine is a ribbon of black ice, snaking through a landscape of shattered brick and twisted iron. At precisely 09 hours, the silence of the frost is not broken by a sudden explosion, but by a low, rhythmic thrum, a vibration that begins in the marrow of the bone before it ever reaches the ear. It is the sound of 10,000 engines, a mechanical tide rising from the west. High above the cloud layer, the condensation trails begin to stitch a white shroud across the pale blue firmament, as hundreds of silver specks emerge from the horizon, glinting like the scales of a prehistoric predator. For the German officers standing on the balconies of their command bunkers, the sight is not merely a military threat, it is a mathematical impossibility manifesting in the sky. The conflict had begun with the promise of a new order, a vision of European hegemony forged in the fire of Blitzkrieg. In the early years, the Luftwaffe had been the undisputed master of the heavens, raining down terror from Warsaw to Guernica. The German officer corps had been raised on the doctrine of quality over quantity, believing that superior Teutonic engineering and iron discipline would always overcome the decadent masses of the democratic West. They viewed the United States as a distant, disorganized land of shopkeepers and jazz, a nation far too soft to endure the rigors of
total mechanized slaughter. But as the winter of 1945 deepened, that arrogance was incinerated by the cold reality of the combined bomber offensive. The strategic goal was no longer just the destruction of factories, it was the systematic dismantling of the German soul. In the command centers of the Reich, the atmosphere was one of stifling, claustrophobic dread. The officers moved markers across maps that were becoming increasingly irrelevant, as entire cities were erased between the morning briefing and the evening meal. They had expected a war of maneuver, a war of chivalry and tactical brilliance. Instead, they found themselves facing an industrial leviathan. Factual records from the 8th Air Force indicate that by this stage of the war, the Allies were capable of putting over 2,000 heavy bombers into a single mission, escorted by nearly 1,000 long-range fighters. Against this, the Luftwaffe could often muster fewer than 100 interceptors, many piloted by teenagers with barely 20 hours of flight time. The disparity was not just a gap, it was a chasm. One German colonel, observing a formation of B-17 flying fortresses from the ground, was heard to whisper that it was like watching the movement of the planets, unstoppable, indifferent, and cosmic in its scale. The transformation of the German officer's psyche was profound. The ideology of the master race crumbled under the weight of sheer tonnage. Men who had toasted to victory in the cafes of Paris now stood in the rubble of Essen, watching as the sun
was literally eclipsed by American wings. They began to realize that they were not being defeated by a better soldier, but by a better system, a civilization that could produce a bomber every 63 minutes and ferry it across an ocean with the casual efficiency of a postal service. The fear was no longer of death, but of the terrifying abundance of the enemy. They saw that for every plane they shot down, 3 more appeared the next day. The sky was no longer a battlefield, it was a conveyor belt of destruction. Amidst this rain of steel, a peculiar symbol of this American abundance began to haunt the German ranks, the humble, wax paper-wrapped loaf of white bread. It was a recurring sight in the kits of captured Allied paratroopers or salvaged from the wreckage of downed B-24s. To a German officer, surviving on ersatz coffee made of acorns and dark, gritty rye bread stretched with sawdust, the sight of chemically pure, snow-white bread was a psychological blow. It represented a nation so wealthy, so untouched by the ravages of hunger, that it could afford to give its frontline soldiers the finest flour and sugar. The bread was soft, resilient, and seemingly endless, much like the industrial output of the factories in Detroit and Wichita. To see a downed American pilot casually eating a sandwich of white bread while the Reich starved was to understand with a piercing clarity that the war had been lost long before the first shot was fired. It was the symbol of a democracy that fed its people while the autocracy bled them dry. Historical data from the final months of the war confirms the sheer terror of this aerial blanketing. During the raids of early 1945, the Allies dropped an average of 4,000 tons of explosives every single day. The cries of the German officers were not always literal screams. They were the silent, shattered realizations found in their journals. "There is no more sky," wrote one major in the 12th SS Panzer Division. "There is only the enemy." The ideological shift was absolute. The belief in the Wunderwaffe, or the final victory, was replaced by a hollowed-out nihilism. They saw that the American shopkeepers had built a sky of silver, and that no amount of fanaticism could stop the shadow of 1,000 wings. As the echoes of the sirens fade into the annals of history, we are left to reflect on the nature of that shadow. The blanketing of the skies was more than a feat of logistics. It was the ultimate expression of a free society's collective will. Those German officers, looking up in January 1945, did not just see airplanes. They saw the inevitable conclusion of a world that chooses abundance over scarcity and liberty over chains. The white bread and the silver wings were two sides of the same coin, the product of a people who possessed the luxury of hope. In the end, the greatest weapon of the Allies was not the bomb itself, but the undeniable proof that a nation of free men will always outproduce, outfly, and outlast the dark visions of a tyrant. The sky, once a place of terror, became the blueprint for a future where the only thing blanketing the earth would be the light of a hard-won peace. Would you like me to develop a specific script focusing on the ground-level perspective of a German anti-aircraft battery during one of these 1,000 bomber raids?